The texts that I'm going to talk about today come from a subgenre of travel writing, the 19th century children's travelogue. Popular in their day, these books help us to understand the ways in which 19th century children and young people and their parents encountered Egypt. These fictionalized travel accounts began to be published during the first half of the 19th century in England. There's just a few examples. As the century went on, they fell out of favor in England, but they became popular in the United States, so that most of the later examples on your handout are American. Although a number of the American books were also advertised and sold in England, and one of the things I'm trying to do is to look at that question of what's being distributed where. During the 19th century, the increasing availability of quicker and cheaper transportation meant that foreign travel became a real possibility for more and more people. The growing interest in traveling was matched by a corresponding interest in travel literature, both for those readers who were actually planning to travel, but also for those who simply wanted to enjoy accounts of other people's travels. Authors of juvenile books, urged on by editors and a receptive public, began to turn out travel stories. The standard plot involved a party of young people, sometimes a family, sometimes a group of friends, traveling with knowledgeable adults, parents, teachers, or clergymen. Presenting the accounts of actual scenes and incidents through the lips and eyes of these imaginary travelers, the authors sought to both educate and entertain young readers who might be less attracted by a more sober and didactic method. The books are very much aimed at a middle-class audience, and as the century progressed, they became more elaborate, expensively produced, with a copious number of pictures and maps. They were generally published in series, so Walter's tour in the East took Walter annually to Egypt, Jerusalem, Samaria, Damascus, Constantinople, Athens. The Vassar girls explored South America, much of Europe, Russia, and Turkey, and the Holy Land, including Egypt. While Hezekiah Butterworth's Zigzag Travelers explored the entire world. Many of the series came out annually, with a new book published just before Christmas, and that's an advert for Butterworth's Zigzag Journeys. The books were clearly designed to be educational, often using a conversational format. They included information about history, geography, archaeology, and folklore. And certainly for 21st century readers, they're a bit clunky. You know, there's very much this sort of, Uncle, I've been wondering why the Red Sea is called the Red Sea. Frank, I'm glad you asked that question. They sometimes also included practical information about traveling, so prices of steamships and hotels, or what to pack, how to negotiate various transactions. But despite what may seem to modern readers to be rather dry, long, factual paragraphs, the books do seem to have been well received by 19th century children. In 1949, May Lamberton Becker looked back at her childhood and recalled, "A series of Christmas trees growing taller as I grew, and in the pile of presents, a copy of Hezekiah Butterworth's Zigzag Journeys in Europe, or one of its successors. Always I asked for it, and got it." While some of the authors were themselves armchair travelers and writers, drawing on published accounts of Egyptian travel, a surprising number of the authors that I've given you on that list had first-hand knowledge of Egyptian travel. And of course, the publication of these travelogues coincided with the opening up of Egypt as a tourist destination for both British and American tourists. Now, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, Napoleon's expedition, followed by the publication of Vivant Danon's book in 1802, the Description de l'Égypte, from 1809 to 1826, were key moments in creating the European and American interest in Egypt. In the decades after 1815, Muhammad Ali welcomed European travelers. As Martin Anderson has demonstrated, the few initial travelers to Egypt who discovered they could travel safely published favorable accounts of their experience. These accounts referred to Muhammad Ali's welcome and the safety of travel, which was a signal to other potential European travelers that Egypt was an acceptable destination. As a result, a small but steady stream of sightseeing travelers went to Egypt into the 1830s. European publishing houses published more travel accounts of Egypt, describing it as a land full of sights to see and further fueling tourist interest. By the late 1830s, a growing number of tourists supported expanded local transportation, hotels, and other touristic infrastructure. And that, of course, then led to further growth in tourist numbers. So by the mid-1840s, I'd say, tourism had established enough of a hold on Egypt that acceptable accommodation, transportation routes, and tourist sites had been laid out, guidebooks were available, and travel in Egypt was no longer seen as difficult or dangerous. As the century progressed, more and more accounts of travel in Egypt were published, and they became increasingly similar, as tourists followed a standard route, saw well-established sites, and stayed in tourist hotels. And the themes and tropes we see repeated in the adult books are echoed in the juvenile travelogues. So certain scenes recur repeatedly, in most of the books. And the first of these is the arrival in Alexandria. And that is consistently portrayed as chaotic, with negative depictions of their first encounter with local Egyptian people. On stepping ashore at Alexandria, we met a crowd of those donkey boys that you remember we read about one evening last winter. As soon as we got out of the boat, they came at us, 100 of them. They acted like hungry wolves, shouting in all sorts of dialects, seizing our baggage, pulling on our clothes, crowding us in one direction and pushing us in another, one urging us to ride his donkey for this reason and one for that. We were followed in by a dozen dirty, barefoot Arabs who proved to be dragomans and wanted to travel with us. They chattered and screamed, gesticulated and urged. Each one had a bag of greasy recommendations given him by English or American travelers whom he had taken up the Nile. And particularly those early encounters, but in some of the books, all the way through, those kinds of racist, animalistic images recur. But Alexandria is also frequently the site of the traveler's surprise that their expectations are not being met. Our tourists spent one night at Alexandria at the Hotel Abbot. In the morning, they left the city of the Ptolemies for Cairo by the railway that connects the two cities, intending to spend some days here on their return. "It seems indeed strange to be traveling in cars in Egypt," said Charlie. "Why?" asked his father. "There's something unhistorical about it. Look at those Arabian guards and porters dressed like Englishmen. How much was the fare?" "About $4, second class." Traveling from the city of the Ptolemies to Grand Cairo and the pyramids on an English railway carriage with guards in English clothes, second class, fare about $4. I never dreamed of Egypt in that way. It seems to me ridiculous. And Martin asked, "Where are the ruins, Papa? I expected to see the place crammed with them, but there are nothing but windmills and common houses just round here." And "I think," said Mary, "I had a better idea of ancient Alexandria before I'd seen the modern one." And this clash between their expectation that the ancient Egypt they've learned about in the books they've read in their nursery and what they suddenly find with modern Egypt comes over and over. Other scenes that feature repeatedly include the tourist's first donkey ride, the climbing of the pyramids, and travel down the Nile in a dahabiyah. I'm going to focus now on one of the most detailed juvenile travelogues, The Boy Travelers in the Far East, Part 4th, Adventures of Two Youths in a Journey to Egypt and the Holy Land, by Thomas Knox. This is both one of the most detailed ones, but I think also one of the most interesting of the travelogues. Knox was an established travel writer. By the time he began to write his Boy Travelers series and other children's travelogues, Knox had already made 2 trips around the world as a newspaper correspondent, and had published 5 substantial adult travel books. And as you'll see, one of those included a trip to Egypt. Now his boy traveler book, his Egyptian boy traveler book, first published in 1882, was the fourth in the boy traveler series. Like others in the series, it was an expensive book. It was priced $3, and that was a very high price even for an adult book. I mean, it's interesting, the Knox books are almost twice the price of the Butterworth books. They were very much, so you're talking here about them being bought by quite well-to-do parents and grandparents as Christmas presents. Virtually every page had an illustration. Now, the book is fiction. It told the story of two American teenage boys, Frank Bassett and Fred Bronson, who travel with Fred's uncle. But despite the fictionality of the framing story, Knox was at pains to emphasize the travel experience underlying the book, and therefore his reliability and authority. In the preface he wrote, "The author has twice visited Egypt and has made the tour of Palestine and Syria. The experiences of Frank and Fred in their journeyings were mainly those of the writer of this book in the winter of 1873 to 74 and in the spring of 1878. He has endeavored to give a faithful description of Egypt and the Holy Land as they appear today. And during the preparation of this volume, he has sent to those countries to obtain the latest information concerning the roads, modes of travel, and other things that may have gone changes since his last journey in the Levant. In addition to using his own notes and observations made on the spot, he has consulted many previous and some subsequent travelers, and has examined numerous books relating to the subjects on which he has written." So many authority claims, so many truth claims in that paragraph. And he then lists in the preface 12 scholarly books that he's consulted. Knox's books and other juvenile travelogues raise issues of the boundaries between truth and fiction. Knox is claiming empirical truthfulness for his account, despite it being presented within a fictional frame. All writing, of course, whether presented as fiction or nonfiction, is a construct. And as Akane Kawakami has argued, the image of a country is always fictional to some degree, whether it's created by a foreigner or a native. And I would argue whether it's presented as fiction or nonfiction. Claims to authenticity were a standard convention in prefaces of 19th century travel books. And Knox's use of similar claims for his boy travelers' books would have encouraged his readers to view the books as legitimate accounts of travel, despite their fictional frames. The claims to authenticity, therefore, work at two levels: the claim itself and the imitation of classic travel book conventions. While the truth claims were one of the ways that Knox used in attempting to establish his authority in his children's books, he used a number of other techniques as well. As I had said, Knox's books were profusely illustrated, and that's just a random choice, really, of pictures from The Boy Traveler. Each volume had between 200 and 300 steel engravings. Most also had maps. Now, this added, obviously, considerably to their marketability and their attractiveness. But I think the illustrations also contributed to Knox's claims of authenticity. The reader can see the scenes before him, convincing him of the veracity of the descriptions. Knox's use of illustrations, however, is more problematic than it looks at first glance. Harper, who were Knox's publishers for the Boy Traveler series, allowed unlimited use of their extensive pictorial archives to the authors of their children's travelogues. And so, in fact, the same illustrations appear and reappear in various volumes by different authors. And Knox actually admits to this in his preface. To some authors, he is indebted for illustrations as well as for descriptive or historical matter, the publishers having kindly allowed the use of engravings from their previous publications. And I think the use is more extensive than Knox is suggesting to us there. The critic James Wren was highly critical of the depiction of non-Caucasian subjects in Knox's books, describing them as highly conventionalized, stereotypical icons, devoid both of life and any connection to the text. I've looked at a number of Knox's books. I would certainly concur in relation to his West African volume. But I'm still exploring Knox's use of illustrations in his Egyptian book. And my sense is that the illustrations in this one are both more closely related to the text and more sympathetic and differentiated when portraying local people, especially modern local people. But that needs more investigation. That's only a kind of preliminary impression. The fictional frame within which the books are set is a third-person narrative. But Knox adds verisimilitude through frequent use of fictional first-person accounts. He quotes at length from Frank's notebooks and Fred's letters home. 19th century travel writing exhibited certain forms and conventions, and by extension created expectations in its readers. These included the establishment of a relationship between author and reader as touring partners, an emphasis on honesty, accuracy, and humility, formulaic departure and coming home scenes, the provision of how-to travel information, the inclusion of local history, legends, and anecdotes, the presentation of the exotic, the comparison of the foreign with the familiar, and overt references reassuring readers that actually their home is the superior one and where you really want to live. Now, all of those conventions are prevalent in the Boy Traveller's books, although I will say that Knox does generally show a remarkable lack of condescension in relation to other countries and customs, and he's much less racist than many of the others. That lack is quite unusual among the general run of travel books of this time. But what I'm arguing is that despite their fictional nature and their intended juvenile audience, the books are situated firmly within prevailing travel writing conventions, and were unlikely to provide any surprises for their audience or for the parents and grandparents who were the purchasers of the books. Now, I'd like to conclude with Mrs. Peterkin, she who fainted at the Great Pyramid. From 1881 to 1883, a series of spoof family travelogues appeared in the American children's magazine, St. Nicholas. Although they're humorous, the family constantly leave one or another of their party behind, they lose their luggage, they worry that all the pyramids will have been moved to the New York Museum before they get to Egypt, and so on. So you've got all of these totally silly bits, but nonetheless, the familiar tropes reappear. Finding herself alone on the ship, the rest of the family having somehow been diverted respectively to Mycenae, Mount Vesuvius, Venice, and the edge of the Matterhorn, Mrs. Peterkin is told that when arriving in Alexandria, she will have to be lifted off the steps by Arabs into a felucca, whatever that was, below. She shuddered at the prospect. It was darker than her gloomiest fancies had pictured. She attempts to go back to Southampton to start again, but is then told that it's a French ship, not an English ship, and it's never going back to Southampton. So she carries on to Alexandria. As she descended the side of the ship and was guided down the steps, she closed her eyes that she might not see herself lifted into the many-oared boat by the wild-looking Arabs of whom she had caught a glimpse from above. It's an echo of what we saw before in the less humorous book. But she could not close her ears, and as they approached the shore, strange sounds almost deafened her. She closed her eyes again as she was lifted from the boat, and heard the wild yells and shrieks around her. There was a clashing of brass, a jingling of bells, and the screams grew more and more terrific. If she did open her eyes, she saw wild figures gesticulating, dark faces, gay costumes, crowds of men and boys, donkeys, horses, even camels in the distance. She closed her eyes once more as she was again lifted. Should she now find herself on the back of one of those high camels? Perhaps for this she came to Egypt. But when she looked round again, she found she was leaning back in a comfortable open carriage with a bottle of salts at her nose. And Mrs. Peterkin's next fainting fit, she does seem to do this rather a lot, is after she's lifted up by the guides to the top of the Great Pyramid. Needless to say, she recovers from her fainting fit, re-encounters the rest of the family inside the pyramid, as you do, and delights in sailing in the dahabeah because she never has to think about the cooking or the housekeeping. The Peterkin tales are evidence that by the 1870s, juvenile travelogues about Egypt and the tropes within them were sufficiently familiar to be parodied. A significant way in which both children and adults encountered Egypt, juvenile travelogues, I would argue, need to be included in our understanding of how British and American attitudes towards Egypt were shaped in the 19th century. Thank you.